When I saw my husband flipping through my journal, my heart skipped a beat, but not out of fear of being caught in some terrible lie. It was the dread of him finding those pages. The ones I'd meant to tear out weeks ago but hadn't. I lunged forward, trying to grab the worn leather cover from his hands, but he held it firm, flipping through pages with steady fingers that suddenly seemed far too patient. I watched his face as it shifted with each line he read, his brows furrowing, his lips tightening, his eyes narrowing, and with every subtle change I felt my world cracking open, piece by fragile piece. He was getting closer. I could see where his thumb rested, just 2 pages away from the one that would change everything, the one entry that explained too much and yet not enough, the one that would take all the half-truths I'd been living with and set them ablaze. He turned another page. His hands trembled slightly, and I knew the moment was coming. That single entry would be there, waiting like a loaded gun. My breath was shallow, and I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when panic set in. The taste of iron filled my mouth. Then the worst thing happened. The journal slipped from his grip for just a second, landing open, not on that page, not yet, but his eyes darted, scanning faster now, like he could smell the secret buried in my words. My heart thudded painfully, an uneven rhythm that made my ears ring. I thought of the day 3 months ago, the day everything changed. The day I signed up for something innocent, something harmless, or so I told myself, and walked straight into the kind of choice that rewrites a life. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that grew quietly, patiently, until it became something I could no longer ignore. And before you think you know the ending, let me tell you the truth the way it happened, piece by piece. But first, if you're listening, answer me this: have you ever kept a secret so heavy it lived in your bones? One that you thought you could bury deep, only to find it clawing its way back to the surface? Because that's exactly what mine did. And now, I need to tell you how it all began. It started on a Tuesday, which, like most days in my house, smelled faintly of coffee and routine. The kind of day you could fold up neatly, stack on top of 100 others, and never notice the difference. The clock above the kitchen sink ticked past 9. My husband had already left for work, his plate rinsed, his tie still faintly smelling of aftershave. The house was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy. I sat at the table staring at my cooling tea, wondering when my mornings had started feeling so hollow. I didn't hate my life. That was the strangest part. My husband was a good man, loyal, dependable, the kind who always remembered to change the batteries in the smoke detector before they even ran low. But the days felt like they were on repeat, a loop I couldn't step out of. Wake up, make breakfast, clean, laundry, errands, dinner, television, bed. I thought I'd find comfort in routine as I got older, but instead, it made me restless. Like living inside a song that never reached the chorus. I caught sight of myself in the reflection of the microwave door. The face staring back wasn't unfamiliar, but it wasn't entirely mine either. My hair, once wild and sunlit, was now kept neat, tamed into acceptable waves. My skin, it wasn't that it had aged badly, but the spark had dimmed, the kind that comes from being looked at in a certain way, or from looking at someone else that way. That morning, I made a decision that seemed small at the time. Harmless. I signed up for a yoga class. It wasn't about fitness. Not really. It was about breaking the loop. I'd seen the flyer pinned to the corkboard at the grocery store for weeks, * gentle flow yoga for beginners. Mindful movement for all ages, * every time I stood in line with my basket of apples and bread, I found my eyes drifting to it. That morning, I tore off one of the tabs with the phone number and tucked it into my pocket. When I called, the woman's voice on the other end was warm, and before I could second-guess myself, I'd booked a spot for that evening. The studio was in a converted house on the edge of town. When I stepped inside, I was hit by the smell of sandalwood and something sweet I couldn't place. There were candles flickering along the windowsills, their light soft against pale walls. A low hum of music filled the space, like a heartbeat you could almost feel in your chest. I felt out of place immediately. Everyone there seemed to move with an ease I'd forgotten my body was capable of. And then I saw him. He wasn't what I expected. I don't know what I expected, maybe someone serene, almost invisible, the way instructors sometimes are. But he wasn't invisible. He was very much there. He had the kind of presence that made the room feel smaller, not because he was loud or commanding, but because you couldn't not look at him. His voice carried, low and even, when he welcomed the class. He smiled at me, not the polite, thin-lipped smile you give to strangers, but something warmer. Something that felt like recognition, though we had never met. The class began, and I struggled. My legs shook in positions they shouldn't have. My breath caught when it was supposed to flow. But every time I wobbled, his voice guided me back, steady, patient. At one point, he came over to adjust my posture. His hands were gentle but sure, and for a moment everything in me tightened, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. It had been so long since anyone touched me like that, even in the most neutral, professional way. The class ended, and everyone rolled up their mats, talking softly. I stayed behind a moment longer, pretending to fumble with my bag just to delay leaving. When I finally stepped outside, the evening air felt cooler than it should have, or maybe I just felt warmer. My mind was buzzing with something I couldn't quite name. On the drive home, I rehearsed what I'd say if my husband asked how it went. Asterisk, it was fine. Relaxing, asterisk, that was the safe answer. But what I didn't tell him, what I couldn't tell him, was that for the first time in a long time, I felt awake. And I couldn't stop thinking about the way the instructor's hand had rested, just briefly, against my back, or the way his smile had lingered like a whisper. That night, lying in bed beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling long after the lights went out, the smell of sandalwood still clinging to my clothes. I told myself it was just yoga. But I knew, even then, that wasn't the whole truth. The second class came quicker than I expected. By the time Thursday rolled around, my nerves had already wound themselves into a tight coil, and I couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't as if I owed anyone anything for showing up again. No one would have questioned it. Yoga was supposed to be a healthy thing, after all. But there was a part of me, an insistent whisper, that already knew this was about more than just stretching and breathing. The day itself felt heavier, like it was aware of where I was going. I moved through chores with an odd restlessness, folding laundry without seeing the colors, running a cloth over the kitchen counter just to keep my hands busy. When my husband called during lunch, his voice was cheerful, almost absent-minded, as he listed off errands he'd run after work. I murmured replies, half listening, already picturing the studio, the smell of sandalwood, the dim light, his voice. By the time I pulled into the small gravel lot, my hands were gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The studio looked the same as it had the first time, but somehow I felt different. Inside, the candles flickered in their usual places, but tonight there were fewer people, the class smaller. That made it worse, or better. I wasn't sure. My eyes darted toward him almost instinctively. He smiled when he saw me, not the wide kind of smile that invites everyone, but something smaller, more private, like he remembered me from more than just the sign-in sheet. The class began, the familiar words about breath and movement washing over us. I tried to focus on the positions, on the way my muscles stretched and shook, but I couldn't help noticing the little things. How his voice dipped when he spoke to me, how he came by my mat more than once, adjusting my posture with those steady hands that seemed to linger just long enough for me to feel the weight of them after he stepped back. At one point, he moved behind me, gently correcting the angle of my shoulders. I felt the warmth of his hand, light but undeniable, and for a brief moment, my breath faltered. It wasn't inappropriate, not really. But it wasn't neutral either. When the class ended, the others rolled up their mats and drifted out, their conversations light and forgettable. I lingered, not entirely on purpose, but not entirely by accident either. He walked over. "You did better today," he said quietly. "Or maybe I just fell less," I tried to joke, though my voice sounded softer than I intended. He smiled again, that same knowing smile, and for a second it felt like the room had gone still. We stood there, words hanging between us that neither of us spoke. And then it happened, simple, quiet, inevitable. We kissed. No lead up, no pause to think about consequences, no space to ask ourselves why. Just that one moment, that one kiss, and the sound of my heartbeat so loud it almost drowned out everything else. It lasted only a second, maybe two, and yet it felt longer, heavier. When it ended, we both stepped back, the silence sharp between us. I grabbed my bag, muttered something about needing to get home, and left before I could read his face again. The drive home was a blur of headlights and white lines on asphalt. I could still feel the press of that moment, still taste the ghost of it. When I walked into the house, everything looked the same, the mail stacked neatly, the faint smell of dinner from a meal I hadn't cooked yet, my husband's shoes by the door. He asked how class went, and I said, "Good," like nothing had shifted. Like I hadn't just crossed an invisible line. But when I lay in bed that night, his back turned to me as he drifted toward sleep, I stared at the ceiling again, and this time I didn't just feel awake. I felt changed. The next morning I woke up before the alarm, staring at the faint outline of the curtains while the sky outside slowly shifted from gray to something lighter. I didn't feel rested. My body had slept, but my mind had kept running through the same moment on a loop, that single kiss. It replayed with every detail sharper than the last, the tilt of his head, the warmth of his hand brushing mine when we stepped closer, the way silence had pressed against us right after. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, feet on the floor, listening to the house creak in the early quiet. My husband stirred beside me but didn't wake. He made a soft sound, turned over, and I wondered if he sensed anything at all. The thought was both a relief and a sting. The day ahead felt strange. Not heavier this time, but tilted, like someone had taken my life and nudged it just off balance. I moved through the motions, coffee, breakfast, dishes, but every step was tinted by that memory. It wasn't just the kiss itself. It was the fact that it had happened, that I'd let it happen, and that deep down, I hadn't regretted it, not yet. By late afternoon, I'd already decided I was going back to class. It wasn't planned, or maybe it was, somewhere beneath all the excuses I told myself. I told my husband I needed more structure, that yoga was helping me focus. The words came easily. He didn't question them. Walking into the studio again felt almost too easy. The room was busier than last time, mats spread out in neat lines, soft voices filling the space. But it didn't matter. The moment I saw him, everything else blurred. He greeted me like he greeted everyone else, or at least that's what I tried to convince myself. But his eyes met mine just a fraction longer. The class started, the familiar rhythm of instructions filling the air. I focused harder this time, trying to hide the fact that I was aware of every movement he made. Every time he walked past, my breath caught slightly, though I forced myself to steady it before it could show. He didn't come to adjust me right away, not like before. That made me more aware, somehow. When he finally did, halfway through the class, the brush of his hand against my arm felt even more noticeable for its absence until that moment. It was only a second, a correction to my posture, but it left me unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with balance. When class ended, I didn't linger this time, but I didn't rush either. I folded my mat slowly, every movement deliberate, waiting without looking like I was waiting. He passed by, close enough that his sleeve brushed mine, and in that small contact there was an unspoken acknowledgement, We both knew what had happened before, and neither of us had forgotten. Driving home, I told myself I was overthinking. That it was just yoga, just a moment, just a kiss. But every turn of the wheel, every red light, only reminded me that those justs were already piling up into something bigger. At dinner, my husband talked about work, his voice calm, steady, familiar. I nodded at the right moments, filled his glass, asked him questions, but part of me wasn't there. Part of me was still in that studio, still hearing the soft scrape of mats, still feeling the weight of a hand on my shoulder. After we ate, I loaded the dishwasher while he flipped through channels in the living room. The normalcy of it all was suffocating in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't that I wanted chaos, I didn't. But I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I was living in two separate worlds now. One where everything was exactly as it had been. And one where nothing would ever be quite the same again. Lying in bed that night, my husband's breathing steady beside me, I stared into the dark and tried to picture what it would be like to stop going. To erase the number, fold up the mat, tuck it into a closet and never walk into that room again. But the truth settled heavy in my chest, impossible to ignore. I knew I would go back. By the fourth week, the pattern had settled in like an old song, comforting in its familiarity, but with an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. I woke up, moved through the same rituals of tea and toast, folded laundry with one eye on the clock, and told myself yoga had become part of my new healthy routine. But that wasn't the whole truth, and I knew it. The truth was that the studio wasn't just a place to stretch. It wasn't even just about him, though that was the part one avoided saying out loud, even to myself. It was about the way those hours felt different, carved out from the rest of my life like a small, secret room where the air moved differently and I could breathe in a way I hadn't for years. Still, every drive there made my stomach tighten. Each time I wondered if this would be the night when something tipped too far, when the balance between just yoga and something else would finally break. This time, the sky was overcast, and rain tapped against my windshield as I pulled into the lot. The gravel crunched under the tires, and the studio's warm light spilled through the windows, a contrast to the gray evening outside. Inside, the room was quieter than usual. The class was smaller, just a few regulars rolling out their mats. He looked up as I entered, that same quick smile, but softer now, like it wasn't just habit. The class started. We moved through the familiar positions, the same slow rhythm of instructions, the soft hum of music filling the air. But it felt different tonight. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was the way my thoughts refused to settle. I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. Not the act of it, that single moment was over, but the way it hung in the air now, like something neither of us had acknowledged, yet neither of us had forgotten. When he came by my mat, his hand brushed mine as he adjusted my wrist, and for a second, the entire room seemed to narrow to that one point of contact. "Better," he said quietly, his voice steady. I nodded, not trusting my own. The rest of class passed in pieces, his voice, the rain outside, the quiet shuffle of mats being rolled. When it ended, I found myself staying again, my hands slow on the strap of my bag, my breath caught between leaving and not leaving. He stayed too, tidying blocks, coiling straps. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I left first, stepping out into the rain. The air was cold against my face, the drops sharp, but it felt grounding somehow. The drive home was silent except for the sound of the rain on the roof of the car. At home, I found my husband at the kitchen table, reading something on his laptop. He looked up, smiled, asked, "How was class?" "Good," I said, the same way I always did, my voice steady even though my mind wasn't. He went back to his screen, and I stood there for a moment, my bag still over my shoulder, feeling like I was balancing on a line that kept getting thinner. That night, I lay awake again, the rain still tapping softly against the window. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong. But the truth was, it wasn't about what I had done. It was about what I couldn't stop wanting. The days leading up to the 5th class felt like they were moving through syrup, slow, sticky, impossible to shake. Everything in the house looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. I went through the motions. I cooked, I cleaned, I folded towels into perfect stacks. My husband talked about work and what we might do over the weekend. I nodded, smiled, and answered, but it was as if I were floating slightly above my own life, watching it from a step removed. I thought about stopping. The thought came in flashes, like quick sparks, a warning, maybe, or just guilt trying to steady me. I would imagine calling the studio, saying I couldn't make it back, maybe ever, folding the mat and sliding it into the back of the closet, letting it collect dust until it became just another abandoned hobby. But then I would think of him. The sound of his voice when he told me to breathe. The way his hand felt when it brushed mine. That one kiss that hadn't left my mind since the 2nd class. By Friday morning, I already knew I would go. The studio was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that made every sound sharper, the creak of the floorboards, the soft thud of mats being unrolled. He was there, of course, setting out blocks, his movements easy and deliberate. When he saw me, there was a small pause, not long enough to mean anything if someone else had been watching, but enough for me to feel it. The class started, and for a while, I lost myself in the rhythm, inhale, exhale, fold, reach. But beneath the rhythm was a tension, a hum I couldn't tune out. He moved around the room, correcting postures, offering quiet words to those who needed them. When he reached me, his voice dropped lower, almost unconsciously, and his hand brushed my arm to adjust my elbow. It wasn't much, just a simple correction, but my breath caught, and I felt the weight of it long after he stepped away. When class ended, people lingered less than usual, a few quick goodbyes, the sound of mats snapping as they rolled up. One by one they left, until it was just the two of us and the soft hum of music still playing low. I should have left too. I should have packed my mat, said thank you, and walked out the door. But I didn't. He stepped closer, slow enough for me to move away if I wanted to. I didn't. The silence between us felt full, not heavy, not empty, but full, like it held every thought we hadn't said out loud. And then it happened again. We kissed. This time it wasn't an accident or a moment that could be written off as a slip. It was intentional. A choice. When we pulled back, neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say, not then. I picked up my bag with shaking hands and walked out, my steps too fast, my breath uneven. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every stoplight felt like a spotlight, every glance from another driver like a question I couldn't answer. At home, my husband was sitting at the table reading the mail. He looked up, smiled, asked how class went. Good, I said, the word feeling too small in my mouth. I kissed his cheek when I passed him, the gesture automatic, and then I locked myself in the bathroom for a moment just to breathe. That night, lying in bed, I stared into the dark, the taste of that second kiss still lingering like a truth I wasn't ready to face but couldn't erase. I told myself this was the last time. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't. The days after that second kiss felt different, not louder, not chaotic, just heavier, as if every ordinary thing carried a quiet weight. I made breakfast, scrubbed pans, wiped down counters, and all the while there was a hum under my skin, an ache of knowing I'd stepped past something I couldn't step back from. I thought of calling the studio to cancel, not for a week, not for a class, but for good. I pictured deleting the number, folding my mat, and sliding it into a corner of the closet where forgotten things go. But then, in the same breath, I pictured the way he'd looked at me before that second kiss, the way the silence had been almost louder than words, and I knew I wouldn't do it. My husband moved through the week without suspicion. He asked how class was, told me about a coworker's retirement party, joked about the weather. He was steady, solid, everything he'd always been. And I smiled back, said all the right things, while inside I was folding the pieces of my life into two piles, the one he could see and the one he couldn't. By midweek, he surprised me by suggesting we host a dinner. "It's been too long since we've had people over," he said, his voice casual, already thinking through menus and wine. I agreed, smiling like it was nothing, but inside something tightened. Because the thought flashed almost immediately, what if he invites him? The thought wasn't absurd. He'd met the instructor once, in passing, on one of those rare evenings he picked me up after class. They'd shaken hands, exchanged a few polite words, and that was it. But my husband, ever the generous one, had commented afterward, "Nice guy. Knows his stuff." The dinner talk faded into the background of the week, but it stayed in my mind like a slow drumbeat. The next class felt different from the start. The air in the studio was warmer than usual, maybe from the weather, maybe from the way I was already keyed up before I even stepped onto the mat. The soft music hummed low, the candles flickered, and for a moment I wanted to believe it could still be simple, just breathing, just stretching, just yoga. It wasn't. He moved through the class the same way he always did, calm, focused, professional, but when his hand brushed mine to adjust my wrist, when his voice dropped low as he told me to shift my weight, I felt it. That small current that had started weeks ago and hadn't gone away. After class, people filed out, their voices soft, their bags slung over their shoulders. I stayed behind, slowly coiling my strap, not even pretending it wasn't deliberate anymore. He stayed too. The silence between us was familiar now, heavy but not uncomfortable, and it felt like the room had shrunk around us. He didn't move closer this time. Neither did I. But the awareness hung between us, undeniable, and it was almost worse than the moments when we'd kissed, because it left me wanting, waiting, wondering. When I left, the air outside felt too cool, the sky too pale, and I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, my breath coming shallow. That night, my husband talked about the dinner again, about which friends he might invite, about wine, about music. I listened, nodding at the right moments, but in my mind I was back in that studio, in that quiet after everyone else left. I lay awake for hours after the lights went out, staring into the dark, feeling my chest tighten as I thought about everything that was coming. The truth was simple, and it scared me more than anything else. I couldn't stop. The evening of the dinner arrived with the kind of stillness that feels staged, as if the day itself was holding its breath. From the moment I woke up, I felt it, a low hum of tension, not loud enough to drown me, but steady enough to sit beneath my skin. I moved through the motions of the day like I was tracing the outline of my own life, preparing a house I'd walked through 1,000 times, but today every corner felt sharper, every shadow heavier. I laid out the good dishes, the ones we only used for occasions like this. I polished glasses until they caught the light. I wiped the kitchen counter twice, even though it didn't need it. My husband was cheerful, oblivious, moving through the house with a kind of focused energy I hadn't seen in a while. He uncorked wine to let it breathe, chopped herbs with a rhythm like music, talked about how nice it would be to have everyone gathered again. He mentioned names, friends we'd had for years, people whose lives intersected with ours in neat, predictable ways. And then, casually, almost as an afterthought, he said it. I invited him too. Thought it might be nice for you to have someone from class here. A familiar face. I felt my hand freeze on the drawer handle. He didn't notice. Of course it made sense. On the surface, it was nothing more than kindness. But inside, something clenched, sharp and certain. The hours before the dinner dragged and sped up all at once, like time couldn't decide what to do with itself. I changed outfits twice, then 3 times, staring at myself in the mirror each time, wondering what message each choice sent, to my husband, to him, to me. When the first guests arrived, I pasted on the polite smile I'd been practicing all afternoon. The house filled with voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. The smell of roasted vegetables and bread hung in the air. It all should have felt normal, and in a way it did, except that nothing felt normal anymore. And then the doorbell rang again. I knew it was him before I even saw his face. He stepped inside, carrying a bottle of wine, his voice warm and easy as he greeted my husband, thanking him for the invitation. He smiled at me too, but it wasn't the same smile he gave to my husband. There was something else in it, just for me, something quiet and unspoken that made my pulse thud harder in my throat. Dinner was served, and we all sat around the table. The conversation was light, harmless, talk of work, of vacations, of little things that didn't matter. But under the table, my foot tapped an unsteady rhythm, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. Every time I looked up, I caught him watching me. Not constantly, not enough to draw attention, but enough for me to feel it. Our eyes met and darted away again, like a dance we hadn't planned but knew the steps to anyway. The evening stretched on, each moment taut. I felt like a thread pulled too tight, one wrong movement away from snapping. After dinner, people drifted into the living room with their glasses, my husband laughing at something one of the guests said. I excused myself to grab more wine, retreating to the kitchen, my breath uneven, my hands gripping the counter for balance. A moment later, footsteps followed. He stood in the doorway, quiet, his voice low when he finally spoke. "Do you need help?" I should have said no. I should have sent him back to the others. But I didn't. He crossed the room, and the space between us vanished too easily, like it had been waiting to disappear all along. There were no words, not really. Just the weight of everything that had been building, the glances, the silences, the tension that had been simmering for weeks. And then the thing I had been telling myself wouldn't happen, couldn't happen, did. We spent the night together. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even thought through. It just unfolded, inevitable as rain. Later, we both stepped back, breath unsteady, eyes avoiding each other for just a beat too long. I poured another bottle of wine and carried it into the living room, my face calm, my hands steady even though everything inside me felt like it was shaking apart. The evening went on, the guests laughed, the dishes piled up, the candles burned lower. But I knew, in the quiet part of my mind, that nothing about my life would be the same again. The morning after the dinner felt like waking up inside a room I didn't recognize, even though it was my own. The sunlight crept through the blinds, soft and indifferent, but everything it touched felt different. I sat up slowly, my body heavy, my thoughts heavier. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel restful. I could hear my husband moving somewhere down the hall, his footsteps calm, unhurried. He was humming, a low, tuneless hum that meant he was in a good mood, or at least an ordinary one. I stayed still for a moment, clutching the sheet, as if that pause could delay the reality of what had happened the night before. In the kitchen, breakfast was already on the table, toast, eggs, coffee steaming in our chipped mugs. He greeted me with an easy smile, poured me a cup like nothing had changed. And I nodded, managed to smile back, sat down, and sipped my coffee while the taste of guilt pressed bitter on my tongue. I watched him talk about his plans for the day, errands to run, a call he needed to make, the possibility of fixing the squeaky door hinge in the guest room. He moved around the kitchen the same way he always did, opening drawers, rinsing plates, whistling under his breath. And that was what made it worse, that his world hadn't shifted, that he didn't see the fault line that had opened under our feet. Every small movement felt sharper. When his hand brushed mine as he passed me a plate, it made my chest tighten. When he kissed the top of my head before leaving the room, I nearly flinched, not because of him, but because of me. When the front door closed behind him and the house was mine again, I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, my hands flat on the counter, staring at the small circle of sunlight on the floor. I thought about the dinner, about the way the evening had stretched, taut and fragile. I thought about the moment when everything tipped over the edge. The memory came back not in clear pictures but in flashes, the weight of a glance, the press of silence, the unmistakable truth of what we'd done. I wanted to scrub the house, to erase every trace of that night from the walls, the counters, the air itself. Instead, I walked from room to room, aimless, like I could walk off the feeling. When my phone buzzed, the sound made me jump. It was him. The message was short, almost careful. "We should talk." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, but I didn't type anything. Not yet. The rest of the day moved slowly, each hour dragging like an anchor. I tried to read, couldn't focus. Tried to watch television, turned it off after 5 minutes. Every quiet moment was a reminder. I thought about deleting his message. I thought about throwing my phone across the room. I thought about answering with something blunt and final, "This has to stop," but the truth was I didn't know what I wanted to stop, or even if I could. By the time my husband came home that evening, I had convinced myself I looked normal. I cooked dinner, I asked about his day, I listened as he talked about errands and work. He smiled at me across the table, and I smiled back, and neither of us mentioned the dinner, the guests, or the thing that hung between the cracks of what had happened. When the dishes were washed and the lights were out, I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, my hands clasped together so tightly they ached. I thought about him. About the message. About the words I hadn't written back. I thought about the silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full, the kind that could swallow you whole if you let it. And I knew, as I closed my eyes and tried to force my body to rest, that the night hadn't ended. It had only started something I couldn't yet see the end of. The days after his message felt strangely fragile, like walking across glass that might crack with a single step. I went through the motions of my life, but I couldn't stop hearing those 3 words, "We should talk." They sat in my mind like a bell that had been struck once, still vibrating in the silence. I didn't reply. Not at first. I told myself I needed time to think, that if I stayed quiet maybe the storm would pass, that if I pretended hard enough nothing had happened, I could fold everything back into place. But that wasn't true, and I knew it. I saw the changes in myself before anyone else could. The way I moved through the kitchen, slower, distracted. The way I'd lose track of what I was saying in the middle of a sentence. I thought I was hiding it, but the truth was it was spilling through the cracks. My husband noticed first, though he didn't press. "You seem tired lately," he said one morning, his voice easy, like he was commenting on the weather. "I haven't been sleeping well," I said, because it wasn't a lie. He nodded, poured coffee into my cup, kissed my cheek before heading out the door. The small gestures, the ones I used to find comfort in, now carried a weight that made my chest ache. The phone stayed on the counter, his message glowing like it might burn through the screen. I walked past it a dozen times a day, telling myself I'd answer later, when my thoughts were clearer, when I'd figured out what to say. But my thoughts never cleared. When I finally replied, it wasn't careful or crafted. Just 3 words back, "When and where?" He suggested the studio, after hours, when the lights would be low and the room empty. All day, I felt it hanging over me, the meeting that would either end this or pull me deeper. When I arrived that night, the air felt still, as if the room itself knew what this was. The candles weren't lit, the windows reflected the dim light from outside. He was already there, standing by the shelves where the mats were stacked. For a moment, we just looked at each other, and in that quiet, I felt every choice we'd made stack up between us. "We can't keep pretending this is nothing," he said. I nodded, because he was right. We talked, though it didn't feel like talking, more like letting the thoughts we'd been holding spill out, jagged and unfinished. Words about how we got here, about what it meant, about what came next. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even an argument. It was the sound of two people standing on a line they'd already crossed, wondering if they could ever go back. When I left, the night air felt colder than it had in weeks. I pulled my jacket tighter and drove home in silence, the road stretching ahead like it didn't have an end. At home, my husband was watching television, the glow of the screen painting the room in soft light. He looked up when I walked in, smiled, asked how class had gone. "Fine," I said, the word coming out steady even though nothing inside me felt steady. He turned back to the screen, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the back of his head, the curve of his shoulders, the quiet of our house. That night, lying beside him in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how many truths can live in one room without ever being spoken. And for the first time, I wondered how much longer mine could stay silent. The morning the truth finally rose to the surface didn't begin with a storm, or a fight, or any of the dramatic signs you'd expect. It began quietly, almost gently, sunlight slipping through the curtains, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Everything about it seemed ordinary, and that ordinariness made what came next feel even sharper. I woke before my husband, lying still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the weeks pressing down on me. The days of silence, of half-answers, of smiles that felt thin, had been building into something too big to hold anymore. I could feel it pressing against my ribs, the truth demanding a way out. By the time I walked into the kitchen, he was already there, pouring coffee into mugs, humming that low, absent-minded tune he always hummed on quiet mornings. He looked up, smiled, and for a second I thought I could do what I'd been doing all along, smile back, ask about his plans, push the truth off one more day. But I couldn't. My voice shook when I started to speak, but I didn't stop. "We need to talk." He set the coffee pot down. The hum stopped. For a long moment, he just looked at me, the kind of look that saw more than I wanted it to. I told him. "Not everything, there are always pieces that don't make it into words, but enough. Enough that the room seemed to tilt under the weight of it. Enough that I felt both lighter and heavier in the same breath." He didn't interrupt. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his hand on the table like in some movie. He just sat there, silent, his jaw tight, his fingers curled against the edge of the table. When I stopped speaking, the quiet between us was almost unbearable. He asked one question, then another. His voice was even, too even, and that steadiness made my stomach twist. I answered, each word pulled from somewhere deep and raw. At one point, he pushed his chair back and stood, pacing once across the kitchen, then back again. He ran a hand over his face, the kind of gesture that isn't dramatic but is more telling than words. I sat there, hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting for something, for anger, for forgiveness, for a decision. But none of it came, not yet. The clock on the wall ticked. The coffee went cold. After what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than minutes, he finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I need time," he said. I nodded. My throat felt tight, my eyes burned, but I didn't argue. The rest of the day passed like moving through fog. He left the house for a while, errands, he said, though I didn't ask where. I stayed behind, drifting from room to room, touching objects like they might tether me to the world, the edge of the couch, the rim of a picture frame, the cool surface of the kitchen counter. My phone stayed on the table. It buzzed once, then again. I didn't pick it up. When the sun began to set, the light in the house shifted to gold, then to gray. I stood by the window, looking out at the yard, the street, the lives moving on outside my own. The truth was out now. There was no putting it back. I didn't know what would come next. Whether this would be the end of my marriage, the end of what had happened, or the end of some version of myself I couldn't return to. I only knew that the house felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just different, like the air itself had changed. When I finally turned from the window, the sky was dark. My husband hadn't come home yet, and for the first time in weeks, there were no more lies left between us. Only the long, uncertain quiet of whatever would come after.